When it comes to ancient Egypt, there seems to be this weird, insatiable desire to find something that simply isn't there, especially in the hieroglyphs. So we look at their monuments, for example, the pyramids, and we try to see in them some sort of a product of an alien race, or we try to find in the hieroglyphs hints that this was really aliens who built the pyramids. And this is really strange to me, because what this reveals is that we're trying to look for some sort of simulated origin that is some sort of cheap mystical thrill, a dopamine hit really. But what we really have to look for in the ancient Egyptians is what they really are, which is the very beginning of human spirit coming into its own. They are the temple of the cosmos. They held up the cosmos in their cosmology. And the hieroglyphs, and especially their pyramids, for example, they are a symbol of human spirit coming into its own. Their appreciation of death is, in fact, exactly this. It brings in negativity into the inner and hence denies the immediacy of existence. So this strange, weird fascination with hieroglyphs to me is a denigration of the human spirit and doesn't really look for what Egypt actually brought to the world, what we inherited from them. So what I'd like to do today is I will publish an excerpt of a lecture by Carla Berenice Groh, who is an archaeologist, on the hieroglyphs. This will be about 8 to 10 minutes of her first lecture of a course that she's actually teaching at my Halkyon Philosophy Academy. So if you're serious about trying to understand and trace the ancient Egyptians and their own origin in its own right, then I hope you can take our course. The link to the course is in the description of this video. And with no further ado, I hand it over to Carla.
It was long assumed that hieroglyphs were an intricate web of symbolic ideas rather than an actual writing system, and many attempts were thwarted by the ill-fated belief in the mystical nature of these signs. This initial confusion over the nature of the signs was due to a rather imaginative Greek source by Apollo, who elaborated at length in his work on the Hieroglyphica on how the cultural enigma was to be solved. He convinced posterity that Egyptian priests did not use actual letters for divine things, but whole figures, as a kind of symbolic taxonomy rather than phonetic prose. He insisted on reading ancient Egyptian in coherence with this principle, as a tool for aligning internal patterns with external reality, leading to a more complete form of truth. Most of Apollo's explanations of the meanings behind the symbols were fabricated or heavily influenced by Greek Neoplatonism, but he also correctly identified many of the allegorical concepts associated with the animals and objects themselves. He explains, for example, that the word for sun is written with a goose or duck, depending on your dictionary, because geese love their offspring more than any other animal does. And what added to the confusion of later generations is that he was right in this particular case, and the goose or duck was in fact used to write the word sun. But what Apollo did not understand was that the sign of the goose is utilized only as a phonogram for the sound S-A or sa, phonetically, spelling the word for sun, but not as a logograph, or as you can see in the picture in your handout on page 4, the same hieroglyph is also used as a phonogram in other words that have nothing to do with either geese or offspring. This constituted one of the first major fallacies that stymied the decipherment of hieroglyphic script for centuries, the notion that it was purely a symbolic writing system. In contrast to Apollo's influential allegorical system theory, Arab scholars successfully recognized that hieroglyphs were not purely symbolic, but actually incorporated both phonetic and logographic or pictorial systems. They understood that the ancient Egyptian language was an ancestor of Coptic, and this vital link to a spoken language enabled them to assign phonetic values to various hieroglyphs. Although medieval Arab scholars did not fully decipher monumental texts, their conceptual framework effectively challenged the accepted Western belief that hieroglyphs were merely magical imagery. Later Renaissance and early European scholars heavily relied on the translations and Coptic studies provided by these Arab manuscripts to inform their own work. But mid-17th century scholars like Athanasius Kirchner Kirche still believed in the mystical nature of the ancient script. Believed that eventually undermined all their attempts at decipherment. And it was not until the discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799 that scholars were able to make practical use of the idea that ancient Egyptian was somehow related to modern Coptic, because for the first time they were presented with a hieroglyphic text, which is on the top third of the stone, that had undisputed translations into a known language, which is Greek. That's on the stone's bottom third. And the third shortcut script, called Demotic, is what you see in the middle. And now here, there are a few things I need to say real quick about the evolution of the ancient Egyptian language. Ancient Egyptians spoke one native Egyptian language that gradually changed over thousands of years, evolving from Old Egyptian to Middle Egyptian, which is used in most standardized texts and often called traditional or classical Egyptian, and it's what most people learn now in university, and to New Egyptian. And they wrote this language using 4 different scripts over time. Hieroglyphs and an everyday handwriting called hieratic, and a later shortcut script called Demotic, and finally Coptic, which used also Greek letters and is considered a mixture of both Greek and ancient Egyptian. And we still see that we will see that Coptic played a major role in the final breakthrough to decipher hieroglyphs. Scholars in several countries worked on the newly discovered text, and they succeeded in identifying many of the hieroglyphic groups that correspond to words in the Greek translation. But the final breakthrough eluded all of them, except one, a young French schoolteacher named Jean-François Champollion. Based on the work of 2 of his contemporaries, Johann Ackerblad and Thomas Young, Champollion suspected that some hieroglyphic signs might be read phonetically. He then compiled a list of these signs using the cartouches of well-known Greek rulers of Egypt, such as Ptolemaeus and Cleopatra. And you have their cartouches on your handout on page 5. This convinced Champollion that hieroglyphs could be used alphabetically, at least for foreign names, but he still clung to the old creed that they had to be read symbolically. Now, I would recommend you go to page 6 and read along to what led to Champollion's great eureka moment. So the next step and the real breakthrough came when he began working on a cartouche with the 4 signs you see in the handout, and what we will later recognize as a sun disk, 3 mammal skins tied together, and the folded cloth signs in the end. From his previous work, Champollion recognized the last 2 signs as S. Seeking a value for the first symbol, he thought of the sun, and the Coptic word for sun is Ra, Ra. This gave him Ra, SS, and immediately reminded him of the name Ramses or Rameses, which was known from a list of pharaonic names in a Greek history of Egypt written around 300 BC. Champollion then noticed the unknown sign in the middle of a hieroglyphic group on the Rosetta Stone corresponding to the word for birth in the Greek text. And since the Coptic word for birth is Mise, this confirmed his reading of the name Ra-Meses or Ra-Mesu, meaning the son is the one who gave birth to him. You see the full cartouche in the handout. And since the little circle with the dot is the sun, which can either signify the sun god Ra and stand for the word day, or functions as a stand-in for the phoneme, 2 letters in this case, Ra, he realized that Ramses was sounded out as Ra-Mesu in ancient Egyptian, using the sun hieroglyph as a phoneme for Ra, the mes, the bundles of skin, as a so-called phoneme or 3-letter consonant sign, and the folded cloth as the alphabetical letter S. And this is what led to his most significant breakthrough in understanding the multifaceted use and ambiguity of the script that had confounded scholars for millennia. He realized that both historical theories were true in some respect, albeit with major concessions. Hieroglyphs are neither a purely symbolic or mystical cipher, nor an alphabetic script, nor solely a logographic system, which is a writing system in which each character represents a whole word or meaningful unit. Instead, ancient Egyptian employs a logophonetic writing system, an ambiguous hybrid that seamlessly weaves together logographic units signifying whole concepts with phonetic signs denoting specific consonantal sounds. To give you another example, in the word for B, or king of Lower Egypt, which is pictured in your handout, the B actually stands for the word B, and with the letter T, the little floating bread that you see on page 7 holds no deeper meaning or symbolism. But the hieroglyph of the B can also be part of the spelling of the word for king of Lower Egypt, which is pronounced BT. So here the B is used logographically to sound out beat, but the B also carries its symbolic meaning as a metaphor for royalty. And this is a characteristic multifaceted use of hieroglyphic symbols. And it's also perfectly illustrated by the scarab hieroglyph, which you also see in your handout, which serves simultaneously as a logograph for the physical beetle when it has a little vertical stroke behind it, and as an ideograph for abstract concepts of form, touching upon its metaphorical aspects of the dung beetle as a symbol for transformation and coming into being. This linguistic function mirrors the Egyptians' biological observation of the dung beetle, which buries its larvae in the sand nestled inside a ball of dung, allowing young beetles to emerge seemingly out of nowhere, symbolizing self-creation. And herein lay the fundamental hurdles to deciphering this script. A single hieroglyphic sign can function pictographically, ideographically, logographically, and phonetically all at once. As we saw in the words for King of Lower Egypt and the scarab hieroglyphs, the Egyptians not only relied on so-called ideograms, which are signs that depict an actual object, typically marked by the accompanying stroke, which you saw behind the scarab or the bee in the handout. They also utilized uniliteral alphabetic signs, such as the little T bread loaf and triliteral signs like the scarab, to form what I call a rebus system, where a character representing a concrete object is borrowed to write a completely different word with the same consonantal sounds. So you can see a good example in the word for beauty or perfection on page 8 of your handout, spelled Nefer, where we can see something similar at work. Here we have the triliteral sign, which is the hard and the long, which carries the phonetic value Nefer. And it is paired with two uniliteral signs right next to it. So we have the horned viper, and then we have the open mouth, which is R. The horned viper is F. And while it seems counterintuitive for a highly symbolic writing system to double down on its spelling, these additional signs often help in the pronunciation of words, and they also offer a lifeline to distraught language students in identifying lesser known signs. And these additional signs also held the key to deciphering hieroglyphs, since recognizing these phonetic alphabetical components within royal names brought the final breakthrough that allowed scholars to decipher the script. And once translators like Champollion overcame the modern mind's penchant for rigid categorization and fully embraced the ancient Egyptian principle of deliberate ambiguity, they finally succeeded in deciphering hieroglyphs. And this new way of understanding language and its systematization opened a window into one of the most mysterious and long-lasting cultures known to us.
So as you can already see just from this short excerpt from Carla's wonderful lecture on the hieroglyphs, we shouldn't try and look for something that isn't there, but we should be able and be willing and be open to understand these symbols in their own right, and not try and find some sort of mystical origin in outer space or some race that lives beneath the desert, etc., etc. All of this is just a fancy that has is running amok, frankly. So let's just briefly say something on the course. If you take the course, you will actually walk away from it knowing how to read hieroglyphs. So you'll be able to decipher hieroglyphs for yourself, and also you'll see that there's a stark difference between the sort of new age, esoteric and complete wacko alien stuff and genuine archaeology and Egyptology, which is what we're teaching. But we're also looking at Egypt in its own right and how they understood the cosmos and why indeed they are considered the temple of the cosmos, and why to so many they're really the beginning of everything, the cradle of human spirit. Thank you for listening, and I hope you can take the course. Follow the link in the description of this video. Thank you.